Hi everyone, my name is Dessi Zaharieva. I am an instructor and exercise physiologist working at Stanford University in pediatrics. Today I'm going to be talking about exercise and automated insulin delivery, top tips for type 1 diabetes. These are my presenter disclosures. So today we're going to go over exercise guidelines for type 1 diabetes. We're going to discuss kind of strategies for exercise using AID technology and trying to understand some of the similarities and differences with various AID systems and how we can implement this into clinical care. So we recently published a special issue on automated insulin delivery and exercise, but more specifically, it's a paper focusing on practical aspects for exercise safety. And I think what's important is that many of the manufacturers don't discuss the importance of, unique circumstances. What if someone is disconnecting their pump for 3 hours, or if someone's going to be in the water, or someone's having issues with the taping of their devices? These are the types of tips and tricks that we discuss in the manuscript here. If you simply scan that QR code, it should pop up directly. It's an open access paper, and I'm sure John can help you find it if you're having any issues. So I won't go into too much detail, but one of the things we discuss in the paper, and you can always go back to that for more specifics, is the difference between planned exercise and not planned exercise. For a child that's doing planned exercise, there's a lot of different strategies that they can try. Going from, the top of this table to the bottom, we wanted to kind of highlight the longest and things that take the most planning versus the things that take the least amount of planning, but are still requiring some work before they start exercise. So again, at the top, starting with a combination strategy, you can set an exercise target before the onset of activity, usually 1 to 2 hours before exercise. And you can reduce the mealtime bolus if your exercise is going to be in the next 1 to 3 hours. We'll talk about that in a little bit more later. But that would be a combination strategy where you're doing two different things before exercise. You could also simply set an exercise target 1 to 2 hours in advance of exercise. One other option would be just reducing the mealtime bolus if the exercise is going to be 1 to 3 hours later. And then other options are to switch to manual mode. I know certain people do this for exercises and can manually adjust their settings on the pump. Other options that take a little bit less time would be things like checking blood glucose, whether that's finger stick blood glucose or CGM trend arrows before activity, or simply just checking the insulin on board, or the IOB. This is also really important. I always like to highlight this with all of my patients. Take a look at the insulin on board. I always kind of think the higher the insulin on board, the higher the risk of hypoglycemia during exercise. So we can determine a plan of action when we look at the IOB. And then when we get to the unplanned type of exercise, I would say most of the kids that I see fall into this category. They don't always like to plan super far in advance of activity. We need to always remember to meet kids where they're at. If they're not going to be the type of kid that is planning ahead for exercise, let's find some strategies for them if they don't really plan ahead. One of the easier tips to do is just carbohydrate feeding, eating carbs either at the onset of exercise or during activity to reduce the risk of a low if they're experiencing drops in blood sugars. Other options are to suspend the insulin pump during exercise. Some of the kids that I see, for example, will disconnect their pump if they can, and they don't want to wear anything during exercise. So if they are doing this, we always recommend suspending the insulin delivery at exercise start and then to resume it at the end of exercise. Other kids that I see just simply want to let the system do its own thing. They leave the usual settings on. So it's important that this is an option for many kids as well that don't feel like pre-planning in advance. Just let the system work. We're going to dive into some specifics now with all of the different systems. We're going to start with CAM-APS for exercise. Now, just to preface, I've learned a little bit from John and a couple of my colleagues in Switzerland. We don't have CAM-APS in Europe or in the US right now, but I know in Europe you are using it more regularly. So the standard glucose target for CAM-APS is 5.8 millimoles per liter, but this is customizable at different hours of the day between 4.4 and 11.0. When we talk about an exercise target, that is different than your usual standard target. With CAM-APS, that's called the ease off function, and that's customizable. So depending on where the ease off is set to or what target you set for exercise, the system will work accordingly to, usually be less aggressive in delivering insulin to target that different, exercise target glucose. When we're looking at the algorithm changes with CAM-APS, the ease off function does generally make the algorithm less aggressive. It raises the glucose target to whatever it's been set to. So for an example, 7.5 millimoles, and this will generally reduce the insulin delivered. We talk about the algorithm being less aggressive. The insulin delivery might be cut back by around 30%, but generally what happens is insulin delivery will be stopped if glucose is less than 7.0 millimoles per liter. With autocorrections, the CAM-APS system doesn't actually differentiate between basal and autocorrection. What it does is delivers an extended bolus around every 12 minutes. So it's important to keep this in mind too of how the system's actually working when it comes to exercise. So we want to look at some tips and tricks, what we can do. Typically, we want to set the ease off function at least 1 to 2 hours before exercise. The interesting part about CAM-APS that not all systems allow is that you can actually set a planned ease off, which means that you can actually set a duration from 0 to 24 hours and a time of when you want that ease off to start. So that's where we call it planned ease off. It means that maybe today at 4 p.m., I'm going to be exercising. I can set my system to start the ease off function at around 4 p.m. If I'm going to be exercising though at 4 p.m., I would want that target to be set 1 to 2 hours before. So just remember that. One of the reasons we like to set the exercise targets in advance of activity is it usually takes time to actually get the glucose to that target range. It doesn't happen instantly, even though we can do it at the press of a button to set that target higher. What's also important about the CAM-APS system is if people are experiencing high blood sugars, especially after exercise, I always like to think about this too. If you're using the ease off function, during exercise, but because of that, the algorithm has been less aggressive in delivering insulin, maybe after exercise, kids are noticing blood sugars start to creep up. What's important is that the CAM-APS system has a boost function that can be set where it actually makes the insulin delivery more aggressive, and it can be set up to 24 hours in advance for a maximum of 13 hours. So again, there's a lot of tips and tricks, things that you can set, either in advance of exercise, and it makes it a little bit easier. So if your child maybe that you're, helping isn't a pre-planner, you can kind of set the planned ease off where you can put it for a specific time and it'll automatically enable when you set it. When we're looking at T-Slim, Control-IQ, and exercise, it's important to know, again, some of the device specifics. The standard glucose target is between 6.2 and 8.9. The exercise target, which is referred to for Control-IQ as exercise activity or exercise, the range is between 7.8 and 8.9 millimoles per liter. When we talk about the algorithm changes when you set the exercise activity, generally what happens is insulin delivery is decreased if Control-IQ can predict the CGM glucose to be less than or equal to 7.8 millimoles 30 minutes in the future. And it will increase insulin delivery when glucose is predicted to be greater than or equal to 8.9 millimoles per liter 30 minutes in the future. So a couple of just the algorithm specifics that you don't often see, but that's what's happening on the back end. And then in terms of auto corrections, they will still occur. So it is important to remember that, especially when, if you're telling your patients to eat snacks, maybe before exercise, those auto corrections will still occur. Some tips and tricks setting the exercise target, again, 1 to 2 hours before exercise. One interesting piece about the software version update 7.7 with Control-IQ is that you can now finally set a timer for exercise between 30 minutes and 8 hours in duration. So similarly, before this update, people were having to set kind of exercise activity and they would have to manually turn it off. I think we can all say that working with kids, trying to remember to set it is one challenge, but trying to remember to turn it off is a whole other challenge. So now with the software update, at least you can set it for a specific duration. It's also important to remember that a lot of people like to use the exercise feature at bedtime, essentially raising that target at bedtime. They may not be exercising at bedtime, but it's just one trick that people use overnight to increase their glucose target. But if the sleep schedule is set to start overnight, it's important to know that you can't actually have exercise activity and the sleep feature at the same time. Of course, they're kind of doing two opposite things. So remember that if you are going to be using exercise activity overnight, once that turns off, you need to manually start the sleep schedule. And then lastly, remember that you can set up to 6 personalized profiles where you can actually personalize basal rates, insulin to carb ratios, and insulin sensitivity factors. Now, when we're looking at the MiniMed 780G with exercise, the standard glucose target is 5.5, 6.1, or 6.7. But when we talk about the exercise target, they all have their own terminology. The term is actually temp target, and that target is set to 8.3 millimoles per liter. And then in terms of what happens on the back end, if you set a temp target, generally it reduces the autobasal delivery for that chosen duration, 30 minutes to 24 hours in 30-minute increments. And then what is also different than some of the other systems with the 780G is that when you have the temp target set, auto corrections are disabled. So that is really key and different from some of the other systems like we just talked about, Control IQ. That does not happen. But with 780G, the auto corrections are disabled until the temp target is turned off. So some tips and tricks. Same with every system, trying to set that temp target 1 to 2 hours before exercise, remembering that it takes time to raise the target to 8.3. And then consider, if you're doing a bolus reduction with the meal before exercise, there was a study recently published that around a 25% bolus reduction with the meal before exercise, in addition to setting a temp target before exercise, can reduce the risk of hypoglycemia. I think what's also important to remember, this is not written anywhere in stone, but just some of my personal kind of experience where I've seen this happening. When kids are using temp target, or in general, people are using temp target, typically when it ends at the end of activity, sometimes people are noticing an auto correction occurring after exercise. And the reason this is happening is that during the temp target, when it's set for activity, it's, the target is set to 8.3. It's going to be reducing the insulin delivery during exercise in most cases. So in that period of time, let's say the temp target was set for 2 hours, exercise ends, temp target ends, that insulin delivery was cut back pretty aggressively during exercise, that the pump might auto deliver some insulin. It's considered an auto correction after exercise to reduce the risk of post-exercise hyperglycemia. So just be aware of that. It's been actually working quite effectively, so I wouldn't be concerned about it. We've been noticing this in some of our studies. So just keep that in mind, maybe letting some of your patients know that it's not uncommon to see the system dosing a little bit of insulin post-exercise once the target is turned off. So looking at Omnipod 5 and exercise, the standard glucose target is, you can set up to 8 targets for a 24-hour period from 6.1, 6.7, 7.2, 7.8, or 8.3. And the exercise target terminology we refer to as activity, and that target is 8.3 millimoles per liter. What's actually happening on the back end with an exercise target with Omnipod 5 is generally, they're not going to say this on the front end, but the insulin delivery is decreased by around 50%. Then the target also gets increased to 8.3 millimoles per liter. It's important to know that on the back end, what's happening with the algorithm is any calculated IOB or insulin on board is increased, meaning that the more insulin on board you have, it's counted as a lot stronger when you're exercising to increase the risk of hypoglycemia. And that means that the maximum insulin delivery is restricted as well. And you can enable the, exercise or activity target for 1 to 24 hours. When it comes to auto corrections, they are also disabled with Omnipod 5 when activity is set. And some tips and tricks to remember is that we still want to set activity 1 to 2 hours before exercise. 2 options when it comes to the meal before exercise. Some patients actually just enter less carbs into the system. For example, if I'm eating 40 grams, I might only enter 20 grams into the pump, and that's going to offer less insulin. The other option is if you enter 40 grams into the pump, if that's what you're eating before exercise, you can actually adjust the bolus amount increasing it by 30%, or decreasing it by up to 100%, which would mean no bolus insulin is delivered. So there's two ways to do this. So I just wanted to mention that as well before exercise. One other thing to note is that insulin delivery is constrained by increasing calculations of insulin on board, which we just talked about. One other thing I wanted to highlight is we recently put out a paper looking at swimming with Omnipod 5. We're working on a secondary paper to look at the actual glycemia, but one of the novel findings from this paper that we published in Diabetes Care was actually, we have a lot of swimmers that were in the pivotal trial that were telling us that they were noticing the Omnipod 5 was communicating in water. And that seemed very odd to us because Bluetooth communication generally is pretty weak underwater. But what we noticed after doing a lot of testing on body, as you can see on the right-hand side, we've got a picture of some of the testing that we did, versus we also had some of the participants in the study doing, real-world testing for us as well. We noticed that the inter-device measurement and distance from edge to edge of the device, the closer those devices were together, generally the better the communication was between the system, so between the Omnipod 5 and the Dexcom. This is actually really novel. We've never been able to find any other data on this. We've been working with the engineers at Omnipod 5 to see if there's anything that can be done in the future. But I think one of our main tips is that, we always like to keep the line of sight the same. So meaning keeping, let's say the Omnipod on the stomach and the Dexcom on the other side of the stomach. It's the same line of sight, so it doesn't have to communicate through the body. If we also keep those devices a little bit closer, like if we can have the Omnipod 5 and the Dexcom on the same side on the stomach, we tend to see the communication is a little bit stronger. And so we just wanted to share that highlight. It might be helpful for some of your patients to just note if they're using Omnipod 5, try to keep those devices closer together when possible. So just a couple of things before we wrap up. Some common challenges with exercise and automated insulin delivery. I often get kids telling me devices are falling off. It's really important to remind the kids that you are seeing what the different systems are, what type of tape can work for their body type, skin type. They may have irritations to certain types of overlay tapes. There are a lot of different options, whether it's liquid adhesive, liquid, remover, or they can use different types of tape. It's just important to suggest that to different families so it can help, especially during sports. Some practical tips before we wrap up. First, I think it's important to ask your patients if they're actually having hypoglycemia during exercise commonly. Sometimes I meet with a kid and they'll just tell me, well, my blood sugars are actually often high during exercise. So in these cases, maybe we need to discuss if low blood sugars aren't something that's very common. Let's meet you where you're at. If highs are what we're experiencing, maybe we don't need to be setting exercise targets before exercise. Why don't we just let the system work on its own and see what happens? One thing that I like to do, and I talk about this in the paper that I talked about at the beginning of this presentation, is teaching your kids how to use a modified Borg scale. Some kids don't understand the different intensities of exercise. So a Borg scale is essentially a rating of perceived exertion, how hard they think they're working on a scale of 0 to 10. 0 being sitting on the couch with their feet up, and 10 being the hardest they've ever worked in their life. So if they're working really, really high intensity, they may actually be seeing blood sugars spiking from the adrenaline response, increases in counter-regulatory hormones. So it's important to know that if they don't understand the intensity, maybe they're not using a heart rate monitor, anything like that, they can use something simplified like a Borg scale to understand that maybe with higher intensities, they don't always need to set something like an exercise target. It's also important that as providers, you're explaining the following information: how the exercise target works. As you saw, each system is very nuanced. So it's important to explain to kids like why you're setting an exercise target so far in advance, because it takes time to actually get the glucose to that target. Also remembering the caveat of reducing the mealtime bolus insulin before exercise. For example, with some systems, if you reduce the bolus insulin too aggressively, blood sugars start to creep up before the activity. If you haven't set an exercise target, some of these systems are going to automatically deliver insulin. So it's important to understand that eating a snack, although you think it's beneficial because it's raising your target for exercise, with an automated insulin delivery system, this can actually lead to lows later on. And then why we need to pre-plan so far in advance. Again, just explaining to people that even though you're pushing a button to set the target higher, the glucose doesn't get to that target instantly. It usually takes time. And then I think it's also really important to go back to some of the basics, that hypoglycemia prevention is always better than treating a low once it's already happened. So trying to remind kids, if you're looking at your CGM tracings during breaks, if you're playing soccer, take a look at what the glucose is doing. If you start to see glucose levels dropping, then it's important to try to treat that low before it actually happens. All right, some general tips and tricks for exercising with automated insulin delivery. One of the first ones that you've heard me say time and time again is setting that exercise target well in advance of activity. So, this is going to also help reduce the carb intake that's needed before exercise, because sometimes people do really well with just setting an exercise target. Eating a snack closer to the start of exercise, less than 10 minutes before exercise, this can be very helpful. So when that rise is happening, it's actually happening at the same time as when you're exercising. So the pronounced rise is not going to be there as much if you eat your snack a little bit closer to the start of exercise. And like we talked about, otherwise, especially if you're not setting, exercise targets, if you're eating a snack and not taking an insulin, that glucose is going to rise and the system is going to dose you with insulin and cause a low later on. If you're disconnecting the pump for greater than 1 hour, I always recommend to my patients to suspend their insulin delivery. The last thing we want to do is, if blood sugars are high or running a little bit higher than where we want them, if I'm disconnecting the pump, but I'm not suspending it, and of course, this is only in the cases where I can, take my pump off, the insulin delivery might be, automatically dosing to the air, in which case, it's not actually being infused in my body. And that's an important consideration. We always want to suspend the insulin delivery during exercise if we're going to be taking the pump off for a long time. Also noticing that smaller carbohydrates are needed generally to treat low blood sugars, because an AID system already knows when the low blood sugar is happening. If you're setting temp targets, it's automatically going to be, cutting back on insulin. So just remember that because the system already knows that you're exercising, if you've given it some indication, then usually treating for lows, you often need less carbs. And that's something important to remind kids as well. And then generally, there's no real big difference between insulin aspart and faster acting insulin. We've seen this in a number of different papers. I think it's just important to keep using the system as you do, regardless of kind of whether it's insulin aspart or Fiasp that they're using. So to summarize, we know that diabetes technology has come a long way, but we also know that there are still a lot of challenges that remain with exercise. We've published a lot of consensus guidelines and strategies on using, different tips for activity, but these should all be used as a starting point for exercise. For example, some of the key things I tell every kid that I see: try to exercise with less insulin on board. Where possible, it tends to be a really helpful factor when you're exercising. Trying to set exercise targets where appropriate. If you're noticing a lot of lows during exercise, I like to tell my kids to try to set that exercise target well in advance of exercise. But also, if a kid's not going to use an exercise target, let's talk about other strategies. For example, maybe carbohydrate feeding, and either taking less bolus insulin, or maybe having an uncovered snack before exercise, depending on the system they're using. Remember that an individualized approach and tailoring is needed. This is part of the reason that we do the work that we do. Not every system works the same way. Not every person responds the same way. And that's one of the reasons that all of these kids need all of our support. So I always like to say, what works for me might not work for you, and vice versa. So it's important that we individualize and tailor for everyone. I also like to say, make sure you're meeting a child where they're at. It's important that if a kid is an elite athlete versus someone that's trying to get a couple hundred extra steps a day, we need to meet that child where they're at, because they may have very different needs. Finally, we don't have all of the answers. I wish I could bottle up all of the answers and just hand them out. We try to provide as much support as we can. When it comes to exercise, just be kind to yourselves, be kind to your patients. Just know that we may not get it right the first time or the 10th time, but we are doing our best to offer as much support as we can to everyone. Thank you so much, and please reach out if you have any questions. Take care.